The builder of attainder and ex post facto from the criminal subversions enforcing the communism engaged in the extortion against the parties by the taking or the subversion from the kidnapping, which generates the depleting of the resources available until they are no longer capable against the law to provide their legal defense with their lawyers. And thus, the taking clause in the United States Constitution requires the government to facilitate the replacement of the resources to the original value. And thus, the act of having taken it by the compelled communism is nullified as the action of the government tool. And thus, the act of the tool individually having done so in order to prevent the government action owes the value to its original function, funding, for example, the lawyers and the living conditions and the rest of the association's value. And thus the position from Ted Cruz's character, who hates America and is trying to use these extortions in order to destroy it, facilitates the fraudulent use of the takings clause to give unfair valuations of the pricing so that a dollar means 5 cents, and thus the action of its undermining in perpetuity prevents the replacement of the services being defunded, and thus the action requires in the takings to replace it with the equivalent value of its status, and thus the action of it being a level 10 has to be replaced by another level 10, and the having taken it to spend it on something else requires it to be refunded into the level 10 replacement. And thus the action of the revenge X's engaging in the function of having been in romantic relationships with David's character would, in their revenge, actively had to sabotage the attractiveness of their victim in order to have not converted when they lost. And when they lost their contracts in order to acquire the thing from David, the companies facilitated by the insurgency would have actively undermined David's structure according to the estimate, and thus the action of them converting to David's side means they would undermine the sabotage, and thus having failed, and thus a false sense of the loss, and thus be retaliated against their community, and thus the action of the rapist having to assert the superiority for their emotional boost requires them to abuse and destroy the things that they would have liked most, leading to the likelihood conversion, and thus having to protect the raped party from the one that they would have chosen in the free market. And thus the action of having conducted that facilitates the obligation of its replacement, and thus the defamation against their victims would have to require the suppression and lowering of the status against the law, which is illegal as the taking requires the replacement with equivalent value or the restoration of the original, and thus in that action requires the sustaining and protection of the status, which is the actual reading definition of the takings clause, and to the same extent the function of undermining David's legion of lawyers so that they could get their insurgent as a double agent in order to compromise the thing at a certain strategy which would be given up at a further collapsed position requires them to replace the equivalent value that they took fraudulently using the government from the fraud or contempt for court by defrauding or submitting false records to the government in order to get its cooperation against its interest in violation of its standards. And to this extent, the replacement of the lawyers, the replacement of the properties, and so on have to be restored in their entirety, dissolving the framing context generated by the illusions from the human trafficking, which would then be replaced by the legal version, and thus the replacement as an alternative to the legal version has to be replaced by the United States government, and thus the action of the defamation, which requires the lower status, would be dissolved under the correct translation of the takings clause. And to this extent, the injuries would not be viable, and the act of the process being the punishment is illegal. And to this extent, its restoration as quickly as can possibly be generated is a legal mandatory action. The, the existence of the system that we're obstructing facilitates the original valuation and pricing, which, upon examination, is self-validating, which they're frauds in order to give a non-fair price valuation assessed by an outside party would by definition be criminal and undermining it as having not satisfied the responsibilities of the takings clause, and thus the action of the duel is necessary because of the hybrid warfare generated by the insurrectionist separatist Confederates, which having allied themselves with adversaries and potential adversaries, that having sided with foreign parties generates their subjugation, similar to the function of the kingmaker in California being the only one who could acquire the legitimizing of someone being elected in the state of California, which is the point of J. Sekulow's insurrection, as it is a subordination function of selling the United States to China, and thus the action of having laundered it by the CCP's kingmaker facilitates the hate group's activities of arbitrary infinite lawlessness against the law by the replacement government without authority or legitimacy or competence, facilitating the subjugation under the Fugitive Slave Act type legal theory, generates the position of dominance over the other states, and thus the capacity of false authority or false legitimacy in order to engage in the military campaigns to conquer these United States by systemic racism and systemic insurrection and systemic treason. And thus the action of this enforcement engages in the perpetuity of these treasons, which are an infinite threat to the country, and thus the action requires its complete breaking, and thus the domination of its endorsers, as the war against the United States is the definition of treason, and the giving of aid and comfort to its adversaries is treason, and all terrorists in the war on terror are enemies of the United States, and those who give aid and comfort to the terrorists responsible for 9/11, such as the supporting structure of the Confederacy separatists, are guilty of direct treason and funding and giving comfort to traitors in the terrorist operations. And thus the legal proceedings for how to deal with them already exist and or are obstructed, and thus the action of the retaliation is necessary and automatic, requiring the function of the constitutional action in the Declaration of Independence signed Congress, as well culminate in the entirety of the legal theory, challenging the government for the pursuit of the remedy through the nonviolent procedures in Congress, which David is to receive the benefits for, and thus the action of recognizing his title at the time of the case acknowledges him as the patriarchy as the purpose of his being kidnapped for the act of treason to be successful in the generation of the sedition, and thus the action reinforces itself according to that motive for the purpose of destroying the government, and thus the permanent separation of the Confederates from American restrictions, and thus acquiring the purified liberty from God. Congress must therefore be compelled to recognize that status and all of the advantages of the contract schedule being obstructed, which, in the acknowledgement, immediately defaults, according to the record, in the obligation to make David the intelligence oversight top rank general, making David born a 6-star general specifically assigned to Congress. And to this action, this would be his faculties, or the takings clause replacement equivalent faculties of those functions, which would make it his specialty, and thus in that action would actively have to generate the position of that being the action. And with this date set and all of the restorations necessary in the preparation to not be undermined arranged, facilitates an extended period of time in order to catch up, which the Confederates would legally be seeking to advance their agenda by various distractions, such as trying to elect David as vice president. And this would burden him with distraction responsibilities. And he already would be burdened with distractions such as solving the proxy war in Ukraine, and thus these complications expedite the function of it being undermined, which are perfectly legitimate causes, and thus they created the messes in order that the resources have to be distributed to clean up those messes. And this is a demonstration of the previous government's failure to perform its duties and to faithfully execute the laws of the Constitution, and thus the proof of the Confederate separatist function, which is disqualified by their oath breaking. The black market contracts from the hate group, having laundered their murder hope phantom cells to engage in the radicalization retaliations if conditions from their contracts haven't been met, means that they'll retaliate against with permanent or impermanent damages in perpetual harassment, such as things that cannot be fixed, such as permanently maiming, such as stealing a decade of the target's life, such as the function of taking the faculties that they would have had if the party had cooperated in order to prevent them from developing the products necessary in order to have stopped major damages in the defenses, and thus then, in the absence of those structures, creates the damages. And thus, the action of laundering guilt to those parties becomes an active aspect of the arrangements, who, under the illusion, would be hyper encouraged to think that it is something else with completely different standards, far less dramatic or important. And to this extent, the function of them falling for the illusion of Frazu Bulul substantively participates in aiding and abetting through gross negligence or by the blocking of essential pieces of the record to prevent them from properly understanding their role in the world and the consequences of its successes and the devastations of its failings, creates the function that has to be self-identified, and to this extent creates an actual moral problem. And in the absence of that moral problem, in the illusion, they actively have a justification to feel offended by the pushing nature of anyone that would be referring to the real subject in the presence of the cover story, and thus the pushiness of the cover story becomes the normal thing that they would try and avoid legitimately, which is the reason why the actual thing would succeed as the intricate network of the hybrid warfare is actively enforced, which again is reinforced by the refusal to conduct the takings clause fair market value payments, such as the fully insured pricing and valuation of each of the services, products, and concepts, such as dating options from sexual market value. And the act of taking the thing is to be replaced by the equivalent value, and thus the replacement sexual market value, and thus the replacement free market value, and thus the replacement everything else, which is the common reference to the 11-year-old humor of those participating in the Wizards Council, engaging in the enforcement and oversight and planning of the KKK and its Klan rallies, including the fake courts with predetermined answers, gaining targets in pursuit of a crime as a cover story to justify whatever they already wanted to do, as they are and have always been material fraud. And that incorporation is fundamental to premier normalized structures by the Klan in the government, which have been responsible for the enforcement and maintaining of the rape culture. As a distraction to specifically relay the artistic variation, what happens in Final Fantasy VII if the memories is the entirety of their potential, and thus everything is a memory, then the function becomes Minerva, the goddess, which created Cloud, creates the position of the fights with Jenova, which turns into a stalemate. And that stalemate includes the sacrifice of the ancients, which are driven crazy by Jenova, which, like Sephiroth, is a glass cannon that requires aggression as her defenses are irrelevant and is only functional as a defense with an aggressive offense, which is her defense. And thus, the action of this being set up creates the position of the interlocking theories of the entire concept of the game. And to this extent, the function of Minerva having lost requires her to give up Cloud to become Strifer at his original potential, with his original memories without the restraints. But then Strifer is actively connected with Zack and Sephiroth, which creates the lack of the memory of the negative retaliation which Sephiroth, as the World Parasite, uses to come back, similar to how Jenova uses Sephiroth in order to come back, and Sephiroth, having died, needs to come back for Jenova to use him to come back, which requires Cloud in order to resurrect him for their reunion, including the systems of the World Parasite. To this extent, the original value, having been undisturbed for the full potency of the original memories of the trio, generates the position of their highest potential value with the full culmination of the entirety of their memories. To this extent, the function of their ability to rewrite fate by the control of having conquered fate is then generated, which allows them to go into Final Fantasy X in order to collect Sin and Party, and thus return with the function of the Mako, and thus the Mako equipment, which attracts Sin, which is able to be planted for the attack against Jenova at the other side of Jenova from where Sin would be entering. And thus, the city on top of Sin is where Strifer, Zack, Sephiroth, and the rest of the party would be, including the FF7 support cast, such as the Tifa and the uh, Vincent and Barrett's friends. And thus, this would all be on Sin City, which would then actively be attacking. And thus, the act of the aggression on the backside would then address the attention from Jenova to the other side, which would then be addressing all of her aggression and malice towards that, when the actual primary threat would come into its maturity, where Sin City would then destroy the rest of her. And to this extent, the eradication and abandonment of the positions allows for the complete restoration of the system, which then generates the position of Sin to attack the rest of the mining of the memory. And the life stream is then preserved, which does not require Meteor or Holy in order to save the system, which then allows for the rejuvenation and the recreation of life in its full diversity, which restores the life stream to its full potential that had been weakened. Um, and thus, the position of Minerva's weakness, having been in the stalemate, has created the sidestep of the mining of the memory, which then diminished her potential from the life stream, which then is corrected against. But this requires the timeline in Crisis Core for Zack to have defeated Minerva, allowing for the corrections to have taken place, and thus the action of her non-interference with Strife facilitates the capacity of all of this to be initiated. Now, the theory involves the position of Sephiroth receiving the primary aggressions of Jenova that killed the ancients by forcing them into committing suicide by the aggression as the defense from Jenova, which, not being applicable to the subject, facilitates his full memory diversified advantages in his potential, and thus the position of him maximizing his advantage as him in his base value at full memory is stronger than the World Parasite version that had foregone the seemingly insignificant aspects of his memory in favor of hyperabsorbing the memories to become the pseudo-god, like a fattened pig for Jenova, who would then turn around and eat him. And thus, it's similar to the function of the parasite in the praying mantis. Now, the praying mantis goes out and he's a premier top-rated hunter, but the female eats the praying mantis. But they destroyed the female. But then the praying mantis was infected by a parasite which requires it to go into the water in order to be baptized, in order for the parasite to leave it, and thus the position of him escaping that creates the world parasite that was hiding inside of him, reclaiming its position as the female praying mantis, which then goes back to eating him, which, having been destroyed in the previous arrangement, needed the cycle in order to rejuvenate its potential, and thus the losing of the good parts of Sephiroth on purpose, which seemed to have made him more viable, actually made him weaker, and this was not determinable at the time as it was still new and undiscovered and untested, and thus the temperature and the testing of the soundness of the weapon was proven to be inferior, and thus the action of him losing to Strifer and friends becomes the proving of the test that he, as his base form value, would have defeated, and thus the state of weaknesses, and thus it becomes a position of the fattened pig. And the fattened pig in the luau is fattened in order to eat as the preferred mechanism or the preferred version of the pig at its all-time fattest becomes the best delicacy for the luau, which it's then put into a pit and covered with bushes and then cooked in the bonfire, and thus made cooked to perfection. And to this extent, that would be the arrangement that the Jenova parasite would have been generating for him, and thus the mother betraying the son. It continues the cycle of their parasitic relationship and fundamental natures. As Jenova came to this world and ate of the fruit of knowledge, devouring it for the position of the world parasite, similar to the meteor that she rode on, which is a former world which was devoured by her when she, like Sephiroth, was turned into a world parasite, and thus the action of their normal cycles engages in that thorough, active rejuvenation of their species and how it's created, which requires each of these intellectual steps and processes, which can be foregone or accepted, and thus the action of rejecting them ends the world parasite cycle, as long as there are additional world parasites to collect from other meteors. Uh, they too can be destroyed, defending the galaxy against this horrendous monster. A final fantasy. To this extent, the function of the Mako poisoning is then cleansed by the flower's waters with Aerith, and thus the action of Aerith's active magical automatic tendencies as an original ancient facilitates the capacity to have created this waters as the holy water support, which then could have been supplied on the Sin City, which then facilitates the capacity of the perpetual cleansing of the information, and thus the action of having cleansed the body by taking the corpse and tossing it into the lake of flowers, waters, then materializes the function of having purified the parasitic infection, permanently winning the contest through Aerith, the one true goddess, and the blessings of the goddess is the rejuvenating eternal life, and the recycling of the identities, and thus the restructuring of the whole, and thus the capacity for her to have learned her permanent intergenerational purpose allows her to perfect this craft as the replacement to Minerva, which does not require her to die, but merely ascend to the absorption of that power as the new viable queen of the world, hyper accelerating the regrowth and rejuvenation of the life spring by these permanent, these infinite gifts of the goddess and friends, which materialize perfect friendship for all time.